Today we have nearly 1,400 people registered, so there's going to be a lot of opportunities for networking. Take advantage of that. We have 10 minutes to get you to where you're going next. If you want to see a panel called Digital Health Trends and Opportunities, that's upstairs in room 2400. If you want to see some Connecticut innovation companies that are presenting, therapeutic and diagnostic companies, upstairs in room 2410. The companies pitching are Clio, Aromix, Renetics, Thetis, and Cybrexa. So these are A round, B round, C round type companies for interested investors. And if you are staying for the biotech track, we have a panel entitled Breadth versus Depth of Assets and Platform in Value Creation, and that'll be right here. So you have a few short minutes. There's restrooms right down the hall. Okay, so where's the crew at the table? So please, we're going to try to get started. Please take a seat. While everybody's getting settled, we have a treat for you. There's a video that has been provided by one of our sponsors, the Elm City Innovative Collaborative. It's a multi-party, highly collaborative consortium here in New Haven, supported by a grant from CT Next. And they support entrepreneurs and leaders developing places that will attract high talent for our companies. So let's watch this video while we're getting settled.
Has always been about innovation. As a center of excellence in education and research, it has the ideal conditions for life sciences, which include biotech, medical devices, and health tech startups. I'm Shayna, a local entrepreneur and walking tour guide. I will show you how to take its current.
All right, well, we are almost ready to go here. We're just getting our last couple people with microphones. Welcome again. I'm Bill Wiesler. I'm one of your organizers today, and it's my pleasure to introduce this first panel. I have a legal statement to read to you. Any discussion of publicly traded companies is not to be construed as investment advice. So, duly noted. I'm waiting for Domingos, our moderator. Domingos is from the law firm of Saul Ewing, Arnstein, and Lair. Saul Ewing is a really valued partner of Yale's and a leading sponsor of the summit today. We've been working with them for many years, and so many of the startup companies that we spin out of Yale are based on their good work in intellectual property. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Domingos. Thank you for your support and for organizing this panel, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, everybody. Welcome to the panel. Hopefully you're here for breadth and depth versus depth of assets, platform, and value creation. I'm Domingo Silva. I'm a patent attorney with Saul Ewing, and as it has become very clear, I'm not Catherine Doyle. She apologizes for not being here today, but she has a case of bronchitis, so she decided not to share that gift with everybody in the hall. This panel will be basically driven by the experience of the members of the panel, and I want to make this experience as interactive as possible. I invite the members of the panel to share real-life experiences about this dilemma between choosing between depth and breadth of invention. In order to frame this discussion, I'd like to point out that different kinds of sciences developed in labs can either be very broad in scope or very targeted in scope. An example of that, for example, would be a platform which allows for the treatment of different diseases in different contexts. So basically a technology that allows you to target different biological molecules in different parts of the cell. That would be a very broad technology. On the other extreme, you may have targeted technologies, An example would be repurposing of a drug to treat a specific disease. That would be a fairly targeted or narrow technology. And of course, investors will feel differently about the opportunities and challenges of these two extremes. And most of the time, you have an intermediate case where you may have a platform technology, but it's rather narrow, or you may have targeted technology that actually can be broader in the context of treating different diseases. With this introduction, I would ask the members of the panel to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about what they do on a day-to-day basis.
I'm Geeta Vemore with Agent Capital. Agent Capital is a venture capital fund backed by a corporate strategic and also family office of some of the corporate executives and other investors. We started fairly recently, and we actually are investing on the strategy that we had adopted while we ran Baxter and Baxalta's venture group very successfully. So,
great. I'm Kuldeep Niyote. I'm in the Emerging Technologies and Innovation Group at Eli Lilly. In fact, I just started there about 4 weeks ago. And my role is really to lead external innovation with a geographic focus on the East Coast. And specifically, we put into place a strategic interest in new ventures. And when I say new ventures, these are typically very, very early stage ventures that have just transitioned from perhaps discovery in academia or otherwise into a new venture. And we somehow put strategic interest in place, and we can have a longer discussion on what that means, and enable that venture to mature and gain value, and at the right time pursue partnering or collaborative discussions with the new venture.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ben Dake from RA Capital. We're in Boston, and we invest sort of across the liquidity spectrum of biotech, all the way from starting new companies and buying and selling public companies and any place in between. And my role within the firm is to really focus in on those early opportunities. So, what are the interesting key proof of concept experiments that we can build this company around, or sort of how can we aim this pipeline? And so I'm pretty excited about the topic today, and excited to be here with so many innovators today.
Hi, I'm Stacy Seltzer. I'm a partner at Aceling Capital. Aceling is a life science-focused investment firm based in Manhattan. We invest mainly in biopharma, also a bit in the device space. We invest more uniquely both in the public and the private space, looking at mainly clinical stage biopharma, where you get a lot of companies that are very similar, but some tend to stay private and some tend to go public. So we go across both areas.
Hello, my name is Adam Koppel, and I'm at Bain Capital. And within Bain Capital, I work at the Bain Capital Life Sciences Fund, which is a dedicated growth equity, private equity fund focused on the value inflection point of life sciences companies.
I'm Steve Knight. I'm at F Prime Capital, and the easiest way to think about it is this Fidelity's venture capital firm. We invest worldwide in healthcare, mostly on the early stage, but up through some of the later stages.
Great. So I'd like to start this discussion by asking the panel how they go about evaluating technology in a lab or a company in terms of weighing out the benefits and the challenges of breadth versus depth. Maybe we can start with Stacy. When you look at a company, when you're trying to determine whether you want to invest in a company, does this paradox of breadth versus depth play a role, or how do you go about it, mitigating any kind of challenges that you may have?
Sure. So we tend to invest a bit later in the spectrum, more Series B, Series C. So we see a lot of companies kind of in both senses of single asset companies as well as multiple assets, and then all the way over to the platform stage. We've evolved over time. I think when we first started as a fund 20 years ago, we were very single asset focused. And then in funds 2 and 3, we weighed heavily towards more platform. And now in the end of fund 3 and fund 4, we've really started to do a combination of both. And I think, both strategies can be successful. I think what we look at very much is the management team and how they can manage either really problem solving around a single asset and not letting the downside of a binary event really only determine the outcome of a company, or thinking about ways of mitigating that risk. And then on the multiple asset side, can they find multiple assets that are interesting? When we value a company, we tend to value a company based on the first asset, but then also trying to think, can this management team really take these other assets and create some upside for them? So we've been successful in the single asset play. We've had companies like Durata, which developed dalbavancin. It was a single asset company from day one, where we were in a syndicate of 5 venture capital groups that put in roughly $100 million all the way through its IPO and then ultimate acquisition by Actavis. That one worked. I can think of many others that haven't, like a company named Cytos and allergic asthma. There we did some financial structuring in the beginning, where even though the asset didn't work, we basically got back our money, and as an investment it worked out. But we had every conviction that the asset was going to work and that it was going to have positive phase 2b data based on the phase 2a data that we reviewed. And the trial had a huge placebo effect, and the trial didn't work. And so, we see both sides of it.
Okay. I think we look at it a little differently. We also invest in single assets, also in platform companies. I think we come from what the goal of our strategic partner might be. We have been corporate investor for a long time. So we invested in a company a while back, which was supposed to be technically replacing or disrupting entire franchise of a corporation. It was a $2 billion product. It was a product which was manufactured by extracting plasma from people and extracting the product from it. As you can see, the infrastructure that's required for collecting the blood and extracting the component of the blood was going to be very expensive. And so this recombinant company that was making a product that would actually essentially replace the with a single molecule could have disrupted the entire franchise. So we invested in that company. Fast forward today, the product is so far progressing well. We don't know if it's going to get approved in the end or not. And the company was acquired recently for multi-billion dollar by a corporation called Alexion, which was here at one point, as you know, in Connecticut. So we'll just have to see whether that product will hit the market or not. But if it hits the market, certainly it has the potential to disrupt a huge franchise. So that's on the single product side. On the platform side, we actually look at companies that actually can generate multiple products for our corporate partner. So this is the way we look at the two different things, yeah.
Sure, absolutely. So I guess I'm the only one sitting on the panel who is not in a venture group. So what I will not do certainly is talk about anything that's in a portfolio like my panelist here. But what I can do is really give an example of companies that you must all be aware of that have gone through this process where they start off as a platform company. And then I've had the pleasure of following them over many years to see, how they've turned out, what's their fate, how have they acquired value. And let me first start off by saying I think the balance between pursuing a platform and investing into that platform, both from a resource perspective, from a capital perspective, and maturing the platform to the point where it has the potential to deliver assets, which ultimately are, the outcome that is going to give growth and give value to the venture is very important. What you want to do is you want to have that perfect balance. You don't want to spend too much time and resources on the platform and not be in a situation 4, 5, 6 years into the venture of not creating that asset that's going to give you the value. On the other hand, I think, Stacy, you made the point, you don't want to be focused on one asset which exposes you to risk. You have no idea how that one asset, as it goes through preclinical development, clinical development, is going to come up against challenges that you just cannot get over, or the biology is going to come and kick you in the back and say, hey, this is the wrong target to pursue. So that balance is very important, okay? And then let me give an example of a company, Nimbus, which some of you might be aware is a computational-based drug discovery group that has gone into partnership with Schrödinger, which is a very heavy-duty sort of computational machine-developed software to identify small molecules and use in silico methods to optimize it. So Nimbus was formed in 2009. And it's very interesting to see that for almost 5, if not 6 years, they focused on putting resources and capital on developing their platform. And the consequence of that was that they had several assets in their pipeline. And they had a very unique model where they then spun out an asset which was mature into a subsidiary. And they did their first deal, for example, with Pfizer. And over that course of period, they were financed with a Series A, where they got $24 million, and followed by a Series B, where they got $43 million. And the end result of those 5-6 years was that they managed to do 3 or 4 deals in succession, one with Genentech, one with Gilead, one with a couple with Celgene. And the consequence of all that was that the amount of equity that they acquired, once they started making the deals with those big pharma, was amazing. It was up in the, if I recall, up in the $800 million range, whereas the amount of investment that they had put in that first 5 to 6 years was as I said, around $75 million. So they, I believe, had the perfect balance, right? They spent enough time, enough resources, enough capital to build a platform, and at the right time, they started spinning out assets that had acquired the value that allowed them to partner, and in return get capital to keep growing the company.
So in terms of companies that have this platform technology, it seems like at some point they have to convert this platform into an actual product. So Adam, what are your thoughts about the timing for that? How much work do they have to put into validating the platform, and when do they actually have to develop a product? And what should this product be? Should it be a blockbuster, or should it be more of a concept showing that a product within this platform actually is commercially viable?
Yeah, no, well, obviously this concept of platform versus specific product, I think, is a really critical one. And I'm a reforming public market investor that's kind of moved backward into the growth equity stage. So I'll give you 2 major ways that we think about it at our fund. The first is about how value is created, or at least the perspective from a public market investor of how they determine valuation. And the second is the timing, like you said, of the time value of money and how much capital needs to be put in to see a result. So first on this, how does the public market view valuation? And it's 2 very simple things. It's future free cash flow, and it's the multiple someone's willing to pay for that future free cash flow. So we answer the question as to whether it's a platform or a product by saying it's got to be both. If you just have a product and no platform behind it, then the investor can evaluate it and come up with what's the future free cash flow, simply discount it in a DCF, and that's the value of the company. And it's really challenging to get a multiple on that value. If you're simply a platform with no specific product, then you can get a high multiple because everyone's excited that you have the potential to create lots of things. But if there's no tangible future free cash flow, there's nothing to multiply that multiple against. So that's problematic. So again, we think of it like a T, where you have the platform at the top and kind of a couple specific projects coming down. And you need to multiply the 2 together to get real valuation. And I certainly think that's how the public market views it. The second component really directly addresses the question you asked, which is how long do people have and what is the timing to get to specificity? And I think that's also critical. We ask ourselves, a couple basic questions before we'll engage and even consider an investment. And the first question we will ask is, can we define the time, capital, and risk required to hit a value inflection point? The time, the capital, and the risk. If you are just a platform company, I think it's challenging for the investor to look at that and be able to define the amount of capital it will take to hit a true tangible value inflection point, the time it will take to do that, and exactly what is being de-risked. Once you then create, though, a tangible product or a tangible program, doesn't necessarily need to be a product, off of that platform, you can better define how much capital will be required, how much time it will take, and what the actual de-risking event is that is creating the value. So I think those are kind of the two ways we think about it. So I think the answer to this question is really, you kind of need to be both.
Yeah, I think if I could expand on that too. When we hear this question, and we spent a lot of time talking about this at our executive session recently, it really is a balance of the two. We want, we're investors. We want both. We want that great sort of killer application, the asset that we can value. And I think RA also coming from the public markets originally, we have this feeling that the public markets really do a lot of your value is determined by that first asset and how much they think you can get credit for that. But my team focuses a lot on really early investors. As imagine a lot of you out there are at that stage where you just want to get your thing done, like prove that this thing works, right? And then maybe think about expanding into making it into a pipeline. And I understand that, but there's actually some folly in that if you can really zero in on that first proof of concept, and it's a way that you can build value. If you can make that a valuable asset rather than saying, this is our first asset, but these other things we can do now are going to be worth a lot more. So we spend a lot of time kind of thinking, how can we prove in this first experiment, if it's preclinical or this first clinical trial readout, that will get you sort of maximum value for that first asset while proving your platform, sort of the best of both worlds. And that's the kind of balance that we look at when we're trying to help sort of gauge either build a platform out of an asset-focused company or really figure out how you could leverage a platform to build that value quickly. Of course, paying attention to those three things that Adam was mentioning, which is what the time is and the capital and the risk that's being taken off as you do that.
I have a question for Stephen. Of course, we're holding this conference here at Yale that's full of researchers with great science behind them. I think a major barrier is how scientists talk to investors and how they can make their science be more attractive from an investor's standpoint. So in your opinion, if a scientist came to you to present their research, what's the most attractive way in which they can discuss this breadth versus depth aspect? I mean, how should they characterize their research, and should they emphasize the immediate products they can put on the market, or should they emphasize the platform and long-term potential, or how should they weigh these two?
Truthfully. So I didn't mean to be so glib about that. I think that part of it is, and maybe we think about platform and products just a little bit differently, and we'll see what happens. So with products, you need capital efficiency, and the data has to demonstrate. So if there's something that you are going after, a specific drug, or and often it is a specific drug, we occasionally invest in devices, the data actually drives whether you want to invest. And since we had our roots in what was then called orphan diseases, in the beginning we worried a lot about what Adam was talking about. More recently, and we actually threw all of that out. And if we're curing patients, then we believed in it, and then we pursued it. So I think with things that were either an asset or a collection of assets, that data is really important, and whether it is addressing a major medical need. When I was in medical school here 30 years ago, one of the reasons that I was depressed was there weren't a lot of diseases, except ironically, as we were talking about infectious disease and surgery and maybe hypertension. There weren't a lot of things that you were actually curing. The great thing about, I think that what is so exciting about now, and why I think the 21st century is, medicine is to the 21st century as physics was to the 20th century, is that we are really curing people. So when it's an asset, if it's a huge unmet medical need, and we are, curing or making a significant dent in morbidity, then we're interested in it. This is somewhat faith-based. We believe that somehow the system will figure out how to pay for it. So far, that's worked. Pricing is a big overhang. With platforms, and it's part of knowing what you are. So if you're not a platform, don't try to sell the platform. A platform, we think about in two different ways. It used to be along the lines of Nimbus, i.e. there's some sort of either new way of looking at drug development, or there's some significant IP. So, like when we invested when we were starting up Beam Therapeutics, the idea was, okay, this is gene editing 2.0. This is a new base editing, is a new way to do it. We wanted to make sure we had all the IP in that area, and that was kind of the platform. Nimbus previously described as it was a different approach, which is this is a new way to use quantitative, a model from Schrödinger to develop new drugs. There's another kind of platform that I think is right now, I think Annie said it pretty well. This is where bubbles are good because you can do these things. There are other times, and before 2012, these really weren't so possible, which I would say are aspirational platforms. So, and we've started a number of these companies like Denali. So neurodegeneration, this is SpaceX meets biotech. Get the best team, pick a big problem, raise a lot of money because you want to have a lot of money, and go to it. And I think that is not a platform in the traditional sense. And again, I think there the diligence is almost, you want the team, you want the problem, and you want to make sure that it is a tractable problem, but trying to figure out cash flows and NPVs becomes really difficult. And obviously there are things in between, so that's maybe the way we look at it.
So I think in the context of this discussion, it's worth bringing up another example, and I'd love to actually hear what the panel has to say about that. You look at a company like Moderna, right? Now, here's a platform-based company focused on using RNA as a therapeutic. And as you can imagine, lots of application, various therapeutic modalities, vaccines, expressing proteins in vivo, et cetera. You look at this company funded by Flagship. Founders were very luminary scientists from MIT. Over years, it has come to the point where without having one real asset, right? All right, not really having a sort of a clinical candidate or a potential therapeutic that really gives it some value. It has generated through an IPO over $600 million, right? And if you look at all what they've disclosed, they have almost 21 RNA-based therapeutics in development, right? And if you look at the market cap, I think it's like 7.5 million. And some people, some analysts even say that that's undervalued, right? I look at examples like that in the context of our discussion, and I question, right? Is that too heavily? Is it too heavily, focused on just developing a platform, creating a hype around the platform? But I'd love to hear what other panelists think about that, versus kind of that right balance.
The only thing that's kind of what I meant about truth. So in the end, and this is where things can go very wrong, even, and maybe how, whether it's a bubble or not. I believe that there has been a secular change that has happened as well. But if there are a couple notable failures that seem like frauds, sure. That's going to be a very bad thing. And so I think that being realistic, that doesn't mean that you have to throw aspirations out the window, but I think that raising money at unrealistic valuations with with nothing to show for it could end, the tail could end very badly that way. So I completely agree with that.
I think in Moderna's example, they were able to maintain very high valuations and a lot of buzz for a long time because they were a private company.
Yep.
And they've more recently gone public and had to kind of open the curtains and show what exactly they're developing, or show some of what they're developing. And I think now there's a bit of more of a clock on their ability to maintain this valuation, because the public investors will demand more information and hold them much more accountable than the private buzz will.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that, Stacey. And we've seen other companies too, where it starts off as sort of a grand science platform without a really good focus. A lot of the CRISPR companies at the beginning, right? There's a lot of academic hype. I remember the story coming out, what a great tool it was for me in the lab, but I didn't quite see solving delivery and how it was going to be a drug, but they're still able to sort of increase that value point based on the promise of it before it maybe zeroed in on the killer app. And Moderna's one also, where similarly, there was a lot of exuberance in the private rounds, and then once it went public, the perceptions around the leads as vaccines, but they've also now sort of opened up their R&D curtain a little bit, and there's these other really exciting things like in vivo reprogramming, or which we, as a scientist, we know that's the potential for mRNA, but you've got to generate the data to prove that it's actually a drug.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'd like to build on something, Stephen, you were saying, and I think others have alluded to it, which is when you're capitalizing a company with a great idea, and you want the big ideas, you want to really try to, like the Denali, I think, is a great example. Really a great company with a great management team trying to solve important problems. How much do you want to capitalize, and what valuation do you want to achieve early on? And it is, it's always a dogma. If you're a management team and you're early investors, the board, it's like, let's raise as much money as we can and let's get as high a valuation as we can. But it can sometimes backfire. And I think there are going to be examples, and I've talked to management teams that kind of regret the fact that they have grown so fast on a promise without really having the time to incubate to kind of prove what they're doing. Because, as you were just saying, at some point, the public market, and eventually these things become public because there's only so much that a private market can fund. If you're overcapitalized at too high a valuation, and you're not given the time to really create the value, and drug and medical device development takes a long time. The cycles are much longer than in technology. You're going to lose the confidence of the new investor, and it's going to be really hard for you to continue to raise that capital. And I'm reminded of a line that I was told when I was in France once, in Burgundy, and they were talking about what makes a great wine. And they actually said, it's the stressful conditions, it's the stressful soil, and it's the stressful weather that actually creates the great wine. And that's how you know what year vintage is going to be perfect. And they say, stress the vine to make great wine. And I think there's something to be said for that also in biopharmaceuticals. If you overcapitalize a company and disenable a management team to just have unlimited resources, and they can kind of do whatever they want with it, they're not going to be ultra focused on getting specific projects done. And then they're going to come to the end of their balance sheet, and they're going to have to go back out to raise more capital. And if they don't have something specific to show for the capital that they just spent, they're going to have a really hard time, both for their existing investors and for the next set of investors. And so whereas I really agree with you, this bubble is important to make major changes and allow kind of new breakthrough technology, I think we have to be careful by bringing in too much capital at one time and not really enabling management teams to kind of percolate a little bit under the radar when there's not so much capital there, prove their technology, and then move forward with the larger capitalization.
I agree. The question is often, what's too much? And I also, the other thing I absolutely agree with is being overly, especially early stage investors, being overly greedy about valuations can have a deleterious effect on companies because there is pressure to overpromise, and under-delivering will be how there'll be some sad stories written. I agree with that.
And I think a little bit of the phenomenon is coming from the tech side. What we're seeing is some of the tech investors are actually coming in and investing in these early stage companies in Series A that, I don't know how far that wave is going to be there and stay. but the bubble that was created on the tech side is literally creeping into the biotech side. And I feel like fundamentally they're two different industries. They can hold on to those valuations and create value because it's more of a different sort of applications of those products, whereas in our case, it's such a regulated industry and a very capitated environment as far as the payers go, that equation really doesn't hold. So I feel like, it is true to have, you need to have enough capital initially to start a company for sure, but there is a point of almost no returns if you do not do it the right way. Yeah.
And in terms of the platform technology, there are people who apply the platform to generate NCEs, new chemical entities, which are distinct from anything that's out there. Other people use the technology to basically take, for example, drugs that are on the market that are approved and modify them and make them better by whatever standards you're using. Is there a preference in the group for choosing one company over the other? I guess the first class of companies that have NCEs have definitely very free IP space, for example, and potentially you could be targeting new therapeutic markets with a new drug, but at the same time you have to go through the whole approval process. Whereas the second group, you're basically building up on drugs that exist in the market, except you already have all those results from those drugs and you're just adding to it. Is there a preference in terms of investment?
Are you talking about repurposing drugs?
More like modifying existing drugs.
Yeah.
So we've made all of those investments, right? We've made strict single asset repurposing programs. We've seen programs with a technology that could, allow, I'm thinking of Ascendis, where you can sort of pegylate and take a peptide or a hormone and extend it and come up with a best-in-class drug there. It just depends on sort of what sort of data you have, what stage they're at, how de-risked, and how big of a problem you've solved with your repurposing, if that's what you're doing.
Yeah, so we're similar. The fundamental thing that we think about, actually, I think, Stephen, you addressing your first comment is we want to work with companies that are trying to solve really important medical issues and go for the companies that are solving unmet medical need. And so we kind of think of the end. And if it's a repurposed drug to really address a huge unmet medical need, or whether it's brand new innovation to address that unmet medical need, we want to support those companies. And the reason for that is both because you want to help the patients in most need, but also because if you're really addressing a problem with an unmet medical need, then the pricing reimbursement debate really won't be as big as it could be if it's not that if it's not that important for unmet medical needs. So I think that's more what we think about, is what is the end market? Because you could have really interesting early innovation, but if it's not relevant to actually create an application for a family or a patient in need, then it's really not worth investing in.
Yeah, so we invested in a company called Palvella, which actually is taking an existing approved product for some of the scientists you'll know here. It's called rapamycin, that actually is used for immune rejection protection. And the scientists found that this molecule actually has really very good application for an orphan disease where you apply the drug topically and not systemically, because initially the drug was developed systemically in these same patients, and it shows some systemic toxicity. So the formulation was changed to a topical application, and it really is doing quite well, and they're going into phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials. So it's completely repurposing existing product for a very novel, different indication. Yeah.
I wonder if the audience has any questions at this point. I'm not sure if there's a microphone. There are microphones. Somebody has a question?
Question for...
Oh, I think... you go next.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Speak loudly. Question for Stephen and Kuldeep in particular. Stephen, because the capital comes in early, it tends to be a little more patient, and Kuldeep because of the fact that you represent the big pharma side. In the light of recent setbacks with Alzheimer's drugs, how and what are you looking at for things like, say, mild cognitive impairment and things of that nature?
we're looking for new approaches and mechanisms that make sense. I mean, so in terms of, I mean, and you do end up balancing your portfolio. So in many ways, for neurodegenerative diseases, Denali was a big effort for a long time. I think that one thing that we're looking at right now is microglia, and in general, the effect of inflammation as a new approach.
Yeah, we also do this quickly. We also started a new company very similar to Denali. We spun out assets out of Pfizer and created a new co called Cerevel with a particular focus in this area. And our initial thoughts were we're going to do everything we can to prevent neurodegenerative disease that's not beta amyloid antibodies, because clearly I think we've well proven that that's not going to work. And I think this neuroinflammation is really a key, and that's going to be a focus for our new company as well. I think that's a big area.
Yeah, I agree that activation of microglia and mechanisms that are involved in that are very good. If you will, sort of the new generation of mechanisms you want to target in neurodegenerative diseases. But I also want to point out that there is interest actually to leverage gene therapy. For diseases like Parkinson's, where you can replace dopamine, for example, where you might have a much more durable response with gene therapy. And again, to go back to our previous conversation, when I look at gene therapy as a modality, here's an example. As some will argue that the space is already saturated, that there are a lot of players and there's a lot going on over there. But I think this is an example where you balance development of a technology that is robust, that allows you to do what it takes to go through the regulatory process, to have a reasonable scale-up CMC commercialization, if you will, insight down the road that is going to make you successful, that's going to actually generate that value from that one or two assets that's going to come out from I'll call it a platform that one could establish. And maybe it's too late in that space, but that's just an example of what would be of interest. Not to take away from your question, but I think it's important to think about that balance again.
We have a question there.
What are your thoughts on working with foundations, co-investors, to be able to move programs that they funded in academia into the commercial space and down the development path, so they can really become products?
I think it's proven to be incredibly valuable. I mean, I think the best tangible example that can come to mind for me, but there's many, is Vertex and cystic fibrosis that I think relied heavily on the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation in the early steps when it was Aurora back in San Diego in the early 2000s. But I think it's the foundations that know about the major unmet medical needs and know the issues of the patients and the families best. So I think having them involved is incredibly helpful.
And the other thing I'll add is, in a related area, patient advocacy groups have been extraordinarily helpful in getting drugs through clinical trials and getting them approved. They help with patient recruitment. They help raise money. They help with the regulators, convincing the regulators to, especially in rare and ultra-orphan diseases, reduce the hurdle to get approved. But they play a major role in our ecosystem that I think goes unnoticed to the larger market.
And in earlier stage, to build on what you were just saying, in the early, because you mentioned from getting it to the academic lab into the I don't want to call it commercial setting, but development setting, which takes more capital. I think at least our investment group, we do rely on the foundation. So we think if they're deep in it and know all the players, and if they're willing to support a particular technology, like that's part of our diligence process, and that's really constructive if we know that a foundation that's completely dedicated. You're seeing this in Duchenne muscular dystrophy as well now, just like you did in cystic fibrosis. So I think we rely on as investors, we rely on their opinion and where their capital goes a lot.
We do, and if you're trying to put together something, say get an asset out of pharma, right, that has shown some sort of promise but has been put on the shelf, we've had great success with using foundations and advocacy groups to sort of make the case that, look, this is a real unmet need, and these are the people, and this is something that we would like to try and form into a company, and maybe we can move it along, give it more priority than it would be, if it's not getting a lot of attention in the pipeline in a bigger company. So that's another way that they were really valuable to us.
Are there other questions?
Hi, could you let me know what issue, challenge, or trend keeps you up at night?
Valuations in this market.
Macro, macro.
Yeah.
Macro
I'd also say, and they could be linked, I think that pricing is a real issue. So it's an issue if people can't pay for drugs. And so there's lots of reasons why things are not the way they should be. And there's plenty of blame to go around. And I think you can categorize different players in different ways. There's a difference between really bad players and then, today, I think there'll be a new gene therapy for a terrible disease that could cost $2 million. So there's a big difference between those two. But it also is true, and as a group that's invested a lot in orphan diseases, if you add them all up, those are big numbers. And so how to work that out, and at the same time, I certainly believe, you need a return on investment. Someone was mentioning at least infectious disease and maybe specifically antibiotics. That is where things are broken right now. I personally, would rather more money going into inventing new drugs than new flat screen TVs or, an app for my teenagers to find the best party. So those don't seem like things that I would like capital allocated to. But that's a big problem, I think. It's not easily solved.
Yeah.
I think sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry, for us sitting in big pharma, it's become clear now that we rely on biotechs, right? And everything that has been happening over the last 5-10 years, where entrepreneurs are taking a high risk, and some of those risks obviously are panning out, and then we're the receiving end. My fear is that, and there's been a huge amount of capital investment that's being put to driving that, and some would argue that there is, it's too much, right? And I'm afraid that there might be some bad investments that are made when there's a lot of capital. Investors seem to want to put money perhaps in places where someone sitting in big pharma might say is completely unrealistic or doesn't make sense. And we just hope that it doesn't flip. Where capital becomes limited, and sometimes those really crazy ideas that should be funded, that have the potential to have a breakthrough product, might not happen. So that's what really sort of keeps me awake at night.
Well, unfortunately, I think we're coming to the end of the session. I don't want to extend it too much into the next session. So before we leave, I'd like to ask our panel to say basically what they think the hot platform or targeted therapies are right now. Just, you don't need to elaborate for a long time. Just what makes you exciting? What makes it exciting in your area right now?
I still think immuno-oncology has not completely solved the issues of curing or making cancer almost chronic. And so anything in oncology, including the CAR T therapies and all the other gene therapy approaches, are something that I'm excited about. Yeah.
I think it's synthetic biology and leveraging synthetic biology under various therapeutic modalities. It can be incorporated into gene therapy. It can be incorporated into manufacturing. And oncolytic viruses for immunotherapy, et cetera. But I think that general area is very, very sort of, in some ways, naive, ready to sort of take off.
think we're sort of excited still about gene therapies, about cytokines, and about TCRs and T-cell engagers. I think it's really going to be some breakthroughs there that allow to sort of realize more promise of IO.
So at Aisling, we're a big proponent of precision medicine. We've had great success in oncology, and recently I've seen a number of companies really trying to apply precision medicine to big diseases and really break them down, and I think that's going to have a lot of success going forward.
Yeah, I agree with the things that have been said really around gene therapy and others, but I more broadly would say it's the new technologies or the new modalities that enable delivery and localization, because there's so many great genes and that we can go after now that we couldn't do with small molecules or just antibodies, but it's this new generation of delivery technologies that's enabling us to attack diseases that we weren't able to attack before.
I'll just add one more, and it's, I would say, the democratizing of cell therapy. So making it so that you can pull it off the shelf and at a reasonable price treat all patients instead of the very few. So that's more of a manufacturing, but it is a technical issue as well.
Exactly. So I'd like to thank everybody on the panel. I'd like to thank the audience, and thanks to everybody.
Really good. I'm interested in the idea.
Thank you, Domingos, and Here, right over here. Let's see. Dormer, you're here. Dormer.
Oh, yes, 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 they did, and I can't remember his name.
Excellent. All right, come on down. So I think we're ready to get started. So it's my pleasure to introduce our next panel moderator, Dormer Stephen from Shipman and Goodwin. Shipman and Goodwin is a really valued partner of Yale's. They're very active here, an important part of our ecosystem, getting companies started and representing those companies from their early days to going public and beyond. And we're really grateful to have Dormer here today and to have the support of Shipman and Goodwin as a major leading sponsor for our meeting. So Dormer, thank you for your support. And the title of the panel today is Business Development and Partnership, Is There an Ideal Time? So let's welcome our panel.
Good morning, everyone. As Bill said, I'm Dormer Stephen. I'm the co-chair of the Business and Finance Practice Group at Shipman and Goodwin here in Connecticut. With me today are my panelists, Sarah Naim from NEA, Mary Nakata from Johnson & Johnson Innovation, Briggs Morrison from MPM Capital, Dennis Patrick at Pfizer Ventures, and Christine Brennan from Mrl Ventures Fund. After each of the panelists gives a brief introduction of themselves and their firm, we'll start the discussion. Sarah?
Great. Can you hear me? Okay. So my name is Sarah Naim, and I'm a partner at New Enterprise Associates, which is a large venture capital firm with two main offices, one in the Chevy Chase area right outside of DC, as well as Menlo Park, and we also have an office in New York. We're a 40-year-old firm on our 17th fund, which is a $3.35 billion fund, out of which about 40% is deployed in healthcare. About $800 or $900 million out of that fund will go into the biopharma space. About half our companies are seed or Series A when we first invest, and about half are later stage. And we also put about $200 million to work in each fund in the public markets, 2 to 3 year time horizon. Invest across all different stages, all different therapeutic areas. I've been at the firm for just over 10 years, and prior to that was at Merrill Lynch. I did healthcare investment banking for a couple of years. Prior to that was here at Yale, where I did an MD MBA, did some banking prior to that, and was by undergrad at Harvard.
Hi, Mary Nakata with JJDC, Johnson & Johnson's Corporate Venture Group. We invest for things that are on strategy for the businesses in consumer, device, and pharmaceuticals. We have 12 investors are based globally in San Francisco, Boston, where I am, London, and Shanghai. We deploy about $450 million in capital every year and invest, again, similar to NEA, at all stages from seed, convertible notes, to Series A and beyond.
Briggs Morrison, executive partner at MPM, established venture capital companies, been around for about 20 years, offices in San Francisco and Boston, almost entirely focused on starting up new companies in the therapeutics area. About 2/3 of what we invest in right now is oncology.
And I'm Dennis Patrick with Pfizer Ventures. I'm a biochemist by training in oncology research and scientific licensing for 30 years. I joined Ventures a couple years ago. I was very closely linked at the hip with our venture team when I was in the licensing team, so I'm quite familiar with what Elaine and Barbara have been doing for the past decade. Pfizer Ventures is what I call a very strategic investor. Our end goal is to license, acquire, do some kind of a collaboration with our portfolio companies. And if you read the news wires this morning, we just acquired one of our portfolio companies today that we invested in fairly recently, last year. So hopefully we'll be making more investments and more deals with our portfolio companies.
And I'm Christine Brennan. I'm with the Mrl Ventures Fund, which is the corporate venture arm of US Merck. We have about a $250 million fund. We also invest early stage, but preclinically, so seed to kind of IND stage. We put about 15 to 20 million to work over the course of the investment. And we invest strictly in therapeutics, so therapeutics only, but any therapeutic area and any modality. And so even though we're the strategic corporate arm of Merck, we actually invest only in the things that Merck is not doing right now. So if a company was doing the exact same target with the exact same modality, we wouldn't do that. We're not here to invest in those things. We're here to invest in the things that they aren't doing. So cell therapies and gene therapies and all of those kinds of things to give Merck exposure to those different areas. We hope that Merck might acquire something, but there's not necessarily any guarantee that that will happen. We don't take any rights. We're all equity. My background, I've been doing venture now for about 6 years here at Merck, and then prior to that was at Novartis Venture Fund, and before that, about 15 years or so doing business development in either small biotech or big pharma.
So I think one of the questions a lot of scientific founders or early stage companies have are, when should I engage a strategic partner? When is it too early? So if you could share your thoughts on that question. Sarah, do you want to start?
Sure, I can go first. I think a lot of our companies, there are some companies who want to stay stealth for as long as possible because of the targets they're working on, or maybe because their approach is differentiated, but more of a trade secret than something that's patentable. And those companies do tend to hold off even necessarily on putting out press releases or making websites. But a lot of companies in our portfolio and that we work with will start engaging pharma partners very early, in part because they can get a lot of good feedback along the way, understand what the partners are looking for, how they think about developing different targets and sort of long-term development. And also there may be certain reasons why you'd want to talk to pharma early. For instance, in immuno-oncology, a lot of the therapeutics really would need to be combined with a PD-1 or PD-L1. So having those conversations early can keep folks like Merck and BMS engaged and interested and able to move quickly once the company gets close to the clinic. Even if it's just a partnership around being able to provide their PD-1 for free. Otherwise, it's extremely expensive to do those combination studies. So I would say engaging early, but not necessarily inking deals early, because a lot of times it takes a while to figure out how deep is the pond, as we say, how many different targets, say if you're trying to drug a particular enzyme class, how many really good targets are there where you can have good biological validation as well as strong chemical matter, starting matter. So we try to get our companies to have those conversations early, but we encourage them to hold off on licensing out, especially obviously the key programs.
I'd say also the last panel talked a lot about platforms. There are companies with platforms that are maybe struggling to find an application or targets, and that's where I would say, unless it's like really hugely transformative, a lot of times if you come to us, because our problems are actually of value, we're not necessarily going to be giving you those targets to apply your platform to on a silver platter. So I would say, work really hard to have a product concept before you engage with pharma, because I think you'll have a greater chance of getting traction. But it does take a lot of work to figure out what's the best commercial, scientific, and clinical way to apply a platform.
So many of our companies, when we start them up, we do have strategic investors. Mary and I actually invest in a company together. I think the only thing I would say is too early is if you don't know what you want your company to be. So I think it's really important for the entrepreneur to sort of decide what is it I'm trying to build before they go talk to a strategic partner. So I think if you're, as pointed out, if you're building an immuno-oncology company, you know you want to combine with the PD-1, that's great. If you have a platform that you're not really sure, as Mary said, where the technology goes, then you have to ask yourself, am I building a company to capitalize on the application of my technology, in which case I may want partners. If I'm building a company where I really know that I don't want actually partners until I get much further down the road. So my only advice to people is you have to think about what it is you want your company to be before you go talk to people.
And can I go backwards? So I invested last year in 2 oncology companies, very different, same $65 million Series A, which was similar. One is filing an IND, within the next quarter, so they obviously have a molecule, they have data. And then the one that I'm in with Briggs it's a screen. They don't have a development candidate. Well, it'll be a while. So then the question is, why would we plug in that early? Well, it's because of the team. It's because it was Kazumi Shiosaki who founded Epizyme and MitoBridge. She's a serial entrepreneur. She knows how to pick drugs. She knows how to make companies. The scientific founders were luminaries. The team, the chemist that she has is first class. And our feeling is if you give Kazumi $65 million, you're going to get something on the other end. Now, if you're a first-time entrepreneur and you have a screen, we're not going to do that. So that's, I think, is very circumstantial also in terms of when we plug in at what stage.
So I think a biotech company has to be very careful and strategic about when to partner with another company, when to sell rights to their drugs or their technologies. I think if you're a single asset company, I think you have to be very careful about going too early, unless, of course, somebody offers you $825 million for your preclinical asset, and then you sell and run. For a platform, I think there's a lot more flexibility. You can apply that to multiple targets and with multiple partners, and they can fund a lot of that platform development and maturation. And I think that's an ideal time to partner early.
Yeah, it's always hard going last because everybody said everything brilliant. But I think it comes down to the different perspectives. So you have the management perspective, you have the board perspective, and then you have your partner, the potential partner perspective. From the management perspective and from the company, I think people have already spoken to this, you really need to sort of figure out what you want to be when you grow up. And what kind of company do you have now, and what kind of company do you want to have? And that will help direct when and if you need a partner and what kind of partner you need. The partner end, having been in business development for a really long time, wants human proof of concept data in 200 patients and great safety and great efficacy. You can wait till you get to that point and then have that partnership so that the pharma company can help you develop. But a lot of times it's difficult to get all the way there without having some feedback, without having maybe even some non-dilutive capital come into the company earlier. And then there's the board perspective, which always kind of, this is always a deep question for us because we don't necessarily want to give up value unless it makes abundant sense. And we're really going to have a partner that we think is going to help develop the company. So it kind of depends on where you're sitting on this table of 3. But you have to really think about it from an entrepreneurial perspective, I think, as to what do you want to be? When does it make sense to get that feedback? I'm not adverse to going out too early as long as you're not disclosing, proprietary targets because it can't hurt to get feedback. And then as you progress, it's always nice for the business development person in pharma to see you said you were going to do X, Y, and Z. You did X, Y, and Z. You knew what to do, you did it, and you did it well, and here's the data. And then you build a rapport and a relationship, so then it's easier to kind of engage and potentially move things quickly when you are ready to get the deal done.
So Christine, what do you see as the advantages and disadvantages of bringing in a potential strategic partner as an investor in your company even before a BD deal?
So see, when I said I went last, now I have to go first. So it really, I have not heard a lot of people complain that it's a disadvantage to have a strategic partner in as a venture investor, or as when they do the agreement. It kind of depends on what that agreement is. If we're talking strictly having a strategic that you've partnered with and it's a collaboration, that's usually, again, a good thing as long as the partnership works well. A lot of this depends on how that relationship goes once you partner with somebody. So if your team does not get along with the Merck team, then it's going to be a disaster. But if you get along and everybody can talk, then you can usually really help to speed along the development. From an investment side, I think that at least our view, being the strategic partner, is that we hope we can bring Merck to bear to our companies. We don't have as much capital as NEA, but what else do we have that we can bring to the table? And that for us is Merck Expertise. Merck people sit on the SABs of our portfolio companies. Merck reagents. We get, if it makes sense, we can do an MTA. We can use Merck models. We may have a really good anti-PD-1 mouse antibody that tends to help if people are doing IO and trying to do combos and realize the commercially available ones don't work so well. So we hope that we can bring those kinds of things to bear for our portfolio companies so that we can help them get to a position where either Merck or someone else can do a collaboration with the company.
There's also a statistic real quick that, let's say in the past 5 or 6 years, of the financings that have done in startups, about 25% of them have had corporate venture investors, but of the successful exits, meaning M&A or IPO, and so maybe the window's more like 7 or 8 years, 50% of them have had a corporate investor. So the question is, chicken or the egg, do we pick them right or do we make them good? It's unclear, but there is an advantage, at least the numbers say that.
I mean, I also think having a corporate venture firm involved in the syndicate is helpful for building the syndicate because things we've done, for instance, with Pfizer Ventures, we say, okay, the Pfizer team, a couple of experts in this particular disease area went in, they reviewed the protocol for this phase 2 trial. They gave a lot of good feedback on it. The company has, incorporated that feedback into the protocol. They looked at the manufacturing. And so they give insight into how the program should be run from a, big pharma level. And it won't always completely align with what the management is doing because they're obviously trying to be as nimble as possible and maybe keep some costs down in terms of clinical development. But I do think it adds another level of feeling that the diligence has been done well if you have a corporate venture firm in.
Yeah, I was going to echo what Christine said. That when we invest, we're very, very active in our companies. We have people on the SAB. We put people together with our Pharm Sci unit. We try to enable them as much as we possibly can. So in that regard, that's a real asset to the biotech company. I think the one risk is if that corporate VC doesn't follow on in subsequent rounds, that can be viewed very negatively. So that's about the only real downside that, from my perspective, that I can see.
Yeah, I think I would agree with Dennis. I don't see a lot of downside. We see tremendous upside of when the corporate venture people participate. They usually bring the company with them, as you all have described. So that's all very, very positive. The question of what if you have a couple of strategics in and then you go try to do a deal with somebody who's not in, does that cause issues? We haven't really found that to be much of a problem.
Happened to me.
No.
So we were in Padlock with Merck Serono Ventures, and BMS bought it. So I mean, we weren't even recused from the room because we were really viewed so much as pure investors that there was no sensitivity. So it does happen. It's not our goal, but to get to the point of these companies are attractive for a host of reasons. So, and we also obviously play nice together. The syndicate that we joined for Ribon Therapeutics, which is a Part 7 company, the Series B was us, Novartis Ventures, AbbVie, and Celgene. So, and they already had Takeda, so there's 5 corporates there.
I will say it's a little different when a firm, a biopharma, particularly device setting, are investing off of their own balance sheet, so not out of a venture group, but more as a from the corporate level, because we've seen in our device companies a couple times where one of the corporate investor who came in and oftentimes they're pricing the round if they're the only investor at something that's very high, which is great, but it can then constrain the company going forward because they've also sometimes are unwilling to cooperate with taking a down round because then it has implications for their accounting and having to report a loss. So in general, those are really good deals because again, they're usually at very high prices that wouldn't be typical investors, even corporate investors are not going to invest at, but it does end up sometimes constraining the company, as well as obviously, I'd say even more in that case than with a CVC. If the corporate investing off their own balance sheet doesn't continue to play through, it sends a bad signal, and it can have all these other repercussions for the company.
So we touched on platform companies a little bit, and obviously the panel before us talked a lot about single asset versus a platform company. If you're a platform company in your early days and you're considering partnering, one of your programs, what are some of the considerations that you want to think through before you do that?
Do you want me to go first?
Sure.
So I think, as I mentioned before, we try to think about how deep is the pond and what are, there may be within a platform company, they may have, let's say, 10 different targets, depending on if their platform is really, we have the best assays for this particular enzyme class that are going to help us pick the best chemical matter against it. Or maybe it's a delivery platform, so it's kind of broader and can be applied to a lot of different things, or going in and looking for tissue-resident Treg targets or something like that. So how many different targets are there, and what's the biological validation for those versus your chemical starting matter? And also, sometimes some of those targets are just going to be harder because an agonist might be harder to develop than an antagonist, or maybe it's going to be applied to a really broad population. So most of our companies are not doing a whole lot in, say, primary care applications, for instance, or again, maybe you can only really develop it in combo with a PD-1, and so it makes sense to look for a partner earlier. So I think the challenge I see, I recently saw a company, for instance, that had really just started and had already inked a deal on 10 targets with a pharma, and got them to invest at a pretty high valuation, which was great for the seed investors, but not so great for people coming in, because how do we know that there's really 50, there'd be 50 great targets. There could be 3 great targets, and then that pharma may have access to those, and you sometimes don't even know when you first start the whole process. So I think really, once you have a sense of how broad is the platform, and are there things you just would absolutely not do within your company, or you're oncology focused, and maybe there's some autoimmune applications. So at the beginning, really only choosing to partner out those things that wouldn't make sense for you to develop in the company. And then as you go further along, then you can, and you develop your own, say, couple of lead programs, and those move along, then you can maybe think about partnering some of the other ones. But the other constraint always is capital. And so in this more frothy environment, I don't think most companies really need to do as much partnering earlier as they may have had to do, say, 7 years ago. So being cognizant of that, and is it more dilutive to, just partner out a couple of high profile or high potential programs versus taking more capital to, make the whole company a broader set of assets you're going after.
So I'd say three points of advice. One is you don't want to be a CRO. So if you have a platform, the last thing you want to do is to do one target with this company, another, and et cetera. And you also don't want to necessarily do things in disparate therapeutic areas, because as you, let's say, go to mature, you want capital, you want maybe M&A. You don't want to look like a company that has an IDV, an oncology, and a respiratory product, because the amount of knowledge, biology expertise you need to make all of those happen is just too broad. The other thing, I guess, on the later end is, I would say, and there's not always agreement at the level of the board. Let's say as you're moving, let's say, towards the clinic, it's really a balance of faith and fear. Because if you have
greed and fear.
Greed and fear, right? But the faith part is like the science. If you really say that you look at the animal data, you look at everything, because a lot of it's the science, that's not always about the team, and you say, this is going to be a blockbuster. This is going to be so active, based on mouse data, and that's the faith part. Versus fear, that's fine, but if we take it to phase 2 and we put $60 million in capital and it's negative in phase 2, we're going to end up with this huge loss. That's the fear part, right? So the fear side would say, let's partner early because, you know, we want a pharma partner to do this and fund it. And the faith piece is, if we're going to get, the ones that are the blockbusters in our experience, we've literally seen eye-popping efficacy and dose escalation in phase 1. One of our drugs, we saw efficacy at what we thought was a no-effect dose, okay? To have partnered that, I'd be like crying like crazy, right? Because you want to take that data, and that's the data that creates these, you know, crazy ass M&As or licenses. But if you had partnered that, like at, you know, at development candidate or IND stage, you know, shame on you. So it's this huge balance, and so that's a part where I don't think there's any good answer. And I know that certain investors, depending on the science, will go one way or the other, and it's a challenge.
Yeah, so just to build on what Marion said, I think here in New Haven, there's a little company called Arvinas that works on degraders. And I think it was interesting to sort of see their strategy of how to do the partnering. So that, to your point, they sort of said, well, the oncology piece, we can go after some validated targets and test our technology, and probably pretty early on assess both safety and efficacy. So that's something we can probably do. There's other therapeutic areas where it's a much longer road, and it's going to take a lot more capital, and maybe those therapeutic areas we think about having partners for those therapeutic areas. As the company evolves, some of those might come in, they say we want to do it ourselves, but I think starting at the beginning it was, well, where can we prosecute the technology in a relatively rapid way that we can sort of do ourselves, and then some of the other applications of the technology might be better with somebody else. There's another company I work on that it's a synthetic lethal pathway company, and so it's all oncology, and so there it's really more a question of, do we have too many targets for us to prosecute ourselves, and would it be helpful to bring in some, you know, a strategic partner who can prosecute some of the other targets and sort of build out the value of the company that way. So I think it depends on how broad your platform is. If it's a multi-TA platform, you might want to think about it that way.
Yeah, another way to look at the decision is, you know, how far can you go with the development of this particular asset with the funding that you have? And if bringing a partner in can make it go much faster and especially the clinical development, much broader, I think that really helps the program and ultimately the company.
Yeah, I would agree. It's always a balance, and it's always a struggle. There is oftentimes no real way to know if you've made the exact right answer until the end of the day comes. I think for people with platforms, there's always this struggle, and there is some value in having a pharma partnership because it kind of validates that platform, and it makes people feel comfortable that there's more reasons to believe. There are other people who also came in and looked at it and had reason to believe that this is going to work. But until you really show that it works, you're going to have a hard time getting that partnership that you want at values that you want for upfronts that you want. So it's a constant struggle.
So how do BD deals impact future rounds, future financings, either who will invest, at what valuations, how do they impact exit transactions or IPOs, if you could talk about that in your experience?
So a pharma partnership that doesn't take equity, right, that just comes in and says, we're going to give you $50 million upfront and biobucks on the back end. From the future round, there's kind of a pro and a con. A pro is obviously people came in, they looked at it, they believe there's now non-dilutive capital coming into the company, and that program has now kind of been probably at least partially taken off your books. And that's great. But you no longer own that. So if I'm thinking about it from all of my opportunities to exit this company, it's, you know, an IPO or an M&A. So either you have enough other programs that I don't have to depend on that partnership to be the pharma company that acquires you, or that's not the money-driving, value-driving program of your company, because when I go to do an IPO, now I don't have that value driver because it belongs to somebody else. So it's, again, another reason why you really have to think about when do you want to partner, which program do you want to partner, why are you partner, what advantages does it give you? Sometimes you're up against the wall and you need the non-dilutive capital, and it's going to just push you over the edge to make sure that you're validated. But other times, it can really influence how the next round goes. It's not a bad thing generally, but I don't think you get quite as much credit for it as people hope that they would get for it when it comes to the valuation for the next company. The valuation's really set more on what are the things that are going to drive your exit and going to drive your exit value. And if somebody already owns that one, you've already gotten the money for that, really. And we don't know what the rest, we can't really count the rest of it. You may have $1 billion in biobucks, but I don't know that you're ever going to get that, so that really doesn't help to drive that part of the valuation.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I think especially in the cases where you're a single or maybe a two-asset company, it can have a dramatic effect on your valuation and impact subsequent rounds. The one area where it may not be quite so impactful is if it's a regional deal or you've only partnered a small amount of the U.S. market, then you retain quite a bit of value and you'll be fine for your subsequent rounds.
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add. I think Christine summarized it very nicely.
I think it also depends on the structure. So the reason I say that is an options, for example, deal can be terminated. And so, at any time, if the strategy changes or the competitive landscape, you could have the asset back in your lap that you fully need to fund if that option is not exercised or et cetera. So I think that's another important thing to consider is, what are the liabilities of those types of structures.
Right, and as long as the option was not taken because of a strategy change and not because they didn't believe in the science, because you will always forever have to explain why so-and-so company didn't take that option, even if it was because they, Pfizer limits their entire neuroscience department, and so they're not going to take the option on this neuroscience thing. You constantly have to have that on bullet 2 of your executive summary, right?
And I think, along the lines of structure, if some of our companies have been able to strike deals where they keep co-promote in the U.S., or it's a co-promote in the U.S. they would market to all the specialists, and the pharma partner would market to more of the primary care sales, use more of a primary care sales force. So those kind of arrangements are not going to get you as much capital up front, and they can be rather onerous to actually execute in both in terms of the contracts and then when the drug is actually being commercialized. But that type of deal allows you to still have skin in the game, and so you can still have the sense that you have economics and sort of will focus people more on that program than if it's just a complete straight out license. And I think in the public market, most companies are really going to be valued off of their primary, their lead program. It depends on the situation, but particularly preclinical programs, IPO investors are not going to spend a lot of time thinking about, even phase 1 programs are not going to spend a lot of time thinking about. And even if you had a whole bunch of phase 2 programs, it just depends on how much time and energy they have. They're really only going to be able to focus in on, a couple of programs. So some of those programs, if you can, it can improve the story in the sense you have more capital on the balance sheet at the time of IPO. If you, out-license one of those programs, and you probably wouldn't have gotten a lot of credit for it anyway. But, it always comes at a cost because one of your programs that you're more focused on could end up failing, and then you're sort of looking to say, well, what else do we have in the pipeline? And if it's just, licensed programs, you'll get very little credit for that in the public market.
So Dennis, you touched on regional deals. I think there's certainly a trend in the market where offshore investors are investing in companies in the U.S., and part of the consideration is that they receive territorial rights either for the single asset or some indications of use for a platform. How does that impact either future financings or ultimately an M&A transaction on the back end?
Well, it'll definitely change the valuation, but as long as the biotech has a substantial percentage of the U.S. market, there's still quite a bit of value there. We acquired Medivation, and that was just for U.S. rights, and Stellus has rest of world, but we still obviously paid a lot of money for that drug in the pipeline. So there's still great opportunity. So if you need the non-dilutive funding, a regional deal is not a bad strategy.
Yeah, I guess I guess I didn't say at the beginning of my introduction, I was the chief medical officer at AZ and was at Pfizer and Merck before that. But we were actually, AZ was a little bit uncomfortable not having complete global rights to the molecule that they bought. They really wanted that from a corporate point of view that every business unit everywhere in the world had the same objectives and they were really driving in the same direction. So understood Pfizer would buy things that they only have the US rights to. I wouldn't say AZ wouldn't, but it was definitely
Not ideal.
It was definitely not ideal. So
Yeah.
I try to encourage people, if you have to do it because you need the money, fine. But really think hard about why you're doing that regional deal, because it could cause a little problems down the road.
Because you end up getting sort of connected at the hip in terms of manufacturing, in terms of adverse event reporting, in terms of what they're doing, in terms of pricing, et cetera. So it's
Definitely adds complexity.
It adds complexity. So you really, to do the second deal, the pharma like Janssen really, really wants that asset because it's really, it creates a challenge,
And I wouldn't underestimate the work it puts on you as the biotech to manage that partnership.
Right, or renegotiate things, et cetera.
It does add a lot of overhead.
Yeah, I mean, we would think of it as it reduces your number of potential partners, or potential acquirers may not, eliminate all of them.
Sure, of course not.
But an Asia rights deal is going to have less impact on potential acquirers than, say, a whole, a European deal, where even fewer people would want to buy something where they don't have European rights. So you have to be pretty thoughtful about those.
Although I will say again, just from the last comment, that China rights actually are, in some cases, more valuable than European rights. So we just have to keep that in mind when you're thinking about those regional deals.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. It's what region? Are really carefully considering which region makes sense for that partnership. Not a lot, but some of the pharma companies will partner with a Japanese pharma because that's just easier for them. Anyway, even if they own their own thing, and even if they in-house develop their own thing, they may partner with a Japanese pharma because that's something that they've done before and it's great and they like that partnership, and then they don't have to worry about Japan or Korea, right? And so if you carved that off versus carving all of Europe off or all of the US off, it's a very different implication to the potential future partners or future acquirer.
But there has been an explosion in folks shopping for China rights.
Absolutely.
And so it's a very recent phenomenon. So it's sometimes hard to turn those opportunities away because there is such an aggressive, inbound interest in trying to explore that.
And higher up fronts that you wouldn't have seen in the past. We even see some venture firms that are focused, or have Chinese LPs or connections to China, trying to aggregate China rights from a bunch of different companies. And so when they we approach them about some of our companies that are raising capital, often that will come up. So how do they think about China rights? Some of these provisions are showing up in term sheets where they want to have a right of first refusal on, within the syndicate on rights in China, which is different and tricky. But there's so much capital in China right now from real estate, and it's, as people here probably know, more and more challenging for that capital to come to the U.S. And rising Chinese middle class and so forth. So it has become a much bigger issue than it had been in the past, or opportunity, but also dilemma.
I mean, have you seen any of your portfolio companies successfully negotiate a clawback or a buyout of those rights? So if you get to an exit transaction and the buyer wants to control worldwide rights, that you have the ability to claw those back? And if you have seen that, how do you deal with the valuation or the repurchase price?
I've never seen a clawback.
No. I mean, there's the commercially diligent efforts that, if they're not doing commercially diligent efforts, you get it back. But usually they define that, well, when I was pharma, we defined that so you could drive a truck through that definition. So it was really hard to say we weren't doing commercially diligent efforts. But that would be the only thing that I've seen that would allow the biotech to really claw it back. But no actual clawback clause that I've seen, at least certainly not recently.
Have you seen any other recent trends in structures or terms of BD deals that you could share?
haven't seen any unique flavors lately. I mean, there's the options, and then, a lot more on the collaboration side, because I think that there are newer technologies, and the pharma likes to get in there and kind of help to, really direct that and play with those technologies, and still, obviously, because it is a new platform or a new modality, really needing the biotech's help, because they're the experts with that new modality. So in those cases, that's a lot more of a FTE-funded collaboration kind of thing, and maybe for a couple of targets or a disease area or something like that. But those are not atypical. I just think that it depends on what you have as a biotech company.
An interesting observation, because we play in 3 sectors, farm, device, and consumers, and in the device and consumer sectors, there is much more of an ability for us as corporates to make an investment and get rights or collaboration for pure equity without non-dilutive funding. And it's because there are fewer device investors, and for some of the consumer products, because we are sort of perceived as sort of the exit and channel, we're shaping that. In other words, versus taking other capital, they're willing to do that. So equity will get us way more in those sectors than in a pharma. I wouldn't even ask for rights with just equity, because there's so much capital and so much return on that capital that there's no way that you can compete as an investor and get that. But you can get, if you're trying to develop a device or a consumer product, that might be something that you have to or are interested in doing, approaching corporates to do that kind of double deal. Right?
So we have a few minutes left. I'd like to open questions up for the audience.
Just one question. There's a lot of discussion about Chinese investors in China with the made in China policy by the Chinese government and the timing of CFIUS. What are the do's and don'ts for companies Chinese investors or Chinese companies are good or bad? Because it's been very, very restricted now. So, for example, having a Chinese investor invest in a U.S.
I don't think they heard you. It's on now.
Yeah, the question is, there's a lot of discussion about Chinese investors and Chinese companies, and with the tightening of the CFIUS rules, which basically says the U.S. government will review whether or not you can or cannot have a Chinese investor or shareholder, including limiteds, right, of a venture firm. It makes it very complicated to decide when to accept Chinese money or not. So are there any do's and don'ts? Because all of you, I'm sure, are faced with that in the work you do in terms of when to say no and when to say yes.
Well, we asked Dormer.
Yeah, I was going to say, call your lawyers.
So no, it's possible to do them. I think, and it's just a matter of understanding what the probability is of it being a national security problem, et cetera. And it also, a lot of these things which are sort of more China rights, which are options, until the thing is triggered, which is oftentimes like years in the future, it's more a matter of negotiating, like who has to deal with these filings and things like that, than the fact that they have to happen. And a lot of these regional rights things don't necessarily come with investment. It's purely a BD deal. And then you don't have to worry so much about CFIUS as it relates to investing. Now, for investing, that's a whole different story, and it's still a gray zone. But I think people, the Chinese investors themselves, are being conservative in some instances, or careful, as are we. But it's not necessarily completely stopping the flow of Chinese investors into the companies. It's just making it much more thoughtful. And in some instances, yeah, maybe slowing it down, but it. And so I think there is an impact, but it's not like it's gone to zero for sure.
I mean, it's certainly a fluid situation as it relates to the biotechnology world. Right now, it really comes down to whether you're in the select group of toxins and agents. But the definition of critical technologies is under review, and I think most practitioners believe it'll be expanded. We're hopeful that it won't be expanded greatly, so it doesn't catch a large number of deals in the net. But CFIUS, if you get caught in the net, it doesn't matter if it's a 0.5% investment. It doesn't matter if it's a $100,000 investment. There's no materiality that goes in, that goes into the equation. It's really, is this critical technology in the biotech world? taking money from an offshore investor. There is a separate side of the house, which is export and licensing. And so if you are doing, rights to an embargoed country like China, then there is a separate analysis for that as well. I think where it really gets tricky on the investment side, for example, is if you have a tranche financing. And right now, you have a company that is not, handling critical technology, but between now and the second or third tranche, it is defined in a way that captures this company. What happens, and how does the syndicate, deal with that hole that could be in the syndicate? And then on the licensing side for an option deal, again, up front, you're not exercising the license, you're just receiving an option. But down the road, the company is defined to be dealing with critical technology. How do you deal with that? And it requires a process to go through, a review process, and perhaps even a consent by the government. So it's an interesting time. I think we're all hopeful that it will be resolved in a way that doesn't have a chilling effect on, capital coming in and deals, offshore licensing deals going forward. Other questions?
On the subject of regional BD deals, in particular, selecting a partner, their view on the market is a big component in terms of finding a deal to be had. Briggs, you were referring to China being viewed in terms of a market potential as potentially greater in circumstances against, say, Europe. I agree with you. What are some of those components that go into that consideration from your perspective when markets generally are not that mature there still in terms of where they are now to where they might be?
Yeah, so I think both Pfizer and AZ have really big components of their commercial organization, their commercial revenue from China. So I think they know those markets actually pretty well, and I think can quite realistically add that into their value equation when they're looking to license things in. Probably Merck as well. I don't know, but I think so. I think some of the large companies have pretty good boots on the ground, deeply understand the Chinese market.
I mean, it can also be a prevalence question. There are certain diseases that are more prevalent in Asian populations, and pricing in particular sectors or if therapeutic areas may be closer or further from say U.S. pricing in Europe as well as in Asia.
My name is Matt Waldman with a company called FitScript. We make a digital therapeutic. Oh, sorry. My name is Matt Walden. I'm with a company called FitScript. We're located here in New Haven. We make a digital therapeutic for diabetes. You haven't mentioned digital therapeutics, and I'm wondering how that fits for you in terms of your future portfolios.
Yeah, I can. We don't as the Mrl Ventures Fund, but we have an entire separate fund called the Global Health Innovation Fund that's actually been around a lot longer than us, that used to do devices, and digital has now completely moved to digital. Their view is much more around being really strategic to Merck and looking at digital things that are actually can impact Merck's current work, whether that's getting scripts, whether that's a diabetes to help whatever the drug that they have to really help patients through a digital, whether a clinical trial, digital patient selection, those kinds of things are really their focus right now. So it's a very big, very active group with, I think it's almost 600 million at this point now, because they're an evergreen fund, that are focused completely on that and personalized medicine, but not us.
I mean, Johnson & Johnson is exploring digital therapeutics. I think we are very focused in certain therapeutic areas within pharm, and so it really depends on the business model in terms of FDA approval, reimbursement versus direct to consumer. But it is definitely something that we are open and are exploring.
Yeah. I mean, I think at some firms, more traditional venture firms, that we have a consumer group at NEA. 60% of what we do is tech, but digital health can sometimes get stuck between different. So it's not the bread and butter of what we do in the therapeutics group, but we have somebody who focuses on services, but also does digital health and HIT. But he's got a lot of really interesting services deals. He can put $50-100 million of capital to work in, and I think it's an area where I think a lot of firms maybe don't have as much focus right now, but hopefully in coming years we'll have more.
I think the reality of the challenge is, there's single drugs that make $6 billion a year, and digital therapeutics are sort of competing for the time and the development costs to be able to bring that digital therapeutic to market. And the question is, will it be able to compete from a revenue perspective with all of these other immuno-onc drugs, et cetera, in terms of the unmet need that are really extending lives for decades, or we're looking for cures in certain serious diseases. So the question is, how does that fit? And that's I think the struggle of why it's a little bit consumer, because some of these things are more wraparound for other products. So, but anyway, but not to say that, but I think that there's tremendous promise and value, and for us, for big pharma like us that really are the ones that are channels for delivering some of these healthcare solutions, you're almost going to need a partner like that to be able to really expand the market for those therapeutics. So.
Okay. Well, thank you all. Thank you to the panelists.
Thank you, Dormer, and thank you to all of our panelists. That was great. So this is, now we get to go enjoy the beautiful outdoor weather that we have, and we have a nice networking break. There are posters outside, 70 posters to see, showcasing our startups. We begin here promptly at 12:30 with a kind of a special video that you might want to see at 12:25. Enjoy the lunch.